It's my pleasure to be here this evening. I was here 2 years ago, and so I'm returning to see dear friends and make others, and to try to share with you something of the heritage of Mount Sinai and St. Catherine's Monastery. We read in the book of Exodus that the daughter of Pharaoh came down to the Nile. There she saw an ark made of bulrushes floating in the water. She sent her maid to fetch it. Inside was a child. She took him up and adopted him as her own son and called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." Moses grew up in the palace, surrounded by wealth, splendor, and power. But learning that he was Hebrew, he identified himself with his own people. This led to his flight into the desert, a desert that the scriptures call the waste, howling wilderness, a land of precipitous granite mountains and narrow, rock-strewn valleys. Water and vegetation are scarce. It becomes a struggle even to survive. Every winter, strong winds blow through these narrow valleys, at times bringing with them sleet and snow. Watching over his sheep and goats, or lying in his tent at night, did Moses recall his days in the palace of Pharaoh? Did it seem to him that from a desire to help his people, he had now lost all opportunity to do so? But everything that happened to him was in the providence of God, who was preparing Moses to become a great prophet and the deliverer of his people. One day Moses saw a bush that was burning, yet it remained unconsumed by the flames. Drawing near to see this strange sight, he heard the voice of God calling to him, "Moses, Moses, draw not nigh hither. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place wherein thou standest is holy ground." Thus begins the story of the liberation of the children of Israel from bondage to Pharaoh. On their last night in Egypt, they kept the Passover, when the angel of death beheld the sprinkled blood of the lamb and passed over the houses of the children of Israel. They walked through the Red Sea as on dry land. They came to Sinai, the mountain of God, where Moses received the tablets of the law and constructed the tabernacle according to the pattern that had been shown to him in the heavens, that the worship of God here below should be unto the example and shadow of heavenly things. They sojourned for 40 years in the wilderness. The life of Moses came to an end on Mount Nebo as he looked into the distance and beheld the promised land from afar. These were the defining experiences of the children of Israel. Centuries later, the prophet Hosea looked back with longing to the sojourn in the wilderness. It had been a time when God was close to his people, when he had dealt tangibly in their midst. And he promised them that again God would bring Israel into the wilderness, where the covenantal alliance would be reconsecrated, as in the days of her youth, and as in the day when she came up out of the land of Egypt. The prophet Micah writes that God will again show marvelous things according to the day of thy coming out of the land of Egypt. The children of Israel passed through the sea, and in the wilderness they ate manna and drank water that sprang forth from the rock. In the first epistle to the Corinthians, the Apostle Paul writes that these are types, foreshadowings of Christian baptism and of spiritual food and drink. Through baptism, we forsake Egypt and come to the mountain of God. Through our faith may be tested, yet God also reminds us of his presence. We are sustained by spiritual food and drink. And at last we cross over the river Jordan and enter into the promised land. In the 4th century, St. Gregory of Nyssa wrote the life of Moses, setting him forth as a paradigm of spiritual ascents. He forsook Egypt and the allure of this world. His soul became light and swift, soaring from below up to the heights. He ascended the mountain, and there spake with God face to face, as a man speaketh with his friend. He did not do so out of fear of punishment, nor out of hope of reward, but seeking to be known by God and to become his friend as goals worthy in and of themselves. Christians came to this remote wilderness at the end of the 3rd and the beginning of the 4th century, the dawn of the monastic movement, seeking to devote their lives to prayer and fasting. But Sinai was more than a stark desert. It was a place where God had revealed himself in such a special way. It was the very emblem of the encounter between God and man. These first Christian hermits wanted to live at the very place where God had said to Moses, "The place whereon thou standest is holy ground." Soon after, this desert also became the goal of pilgrims who made their way to Jerusalem, and if they had the time, the means, and the stamina, they would continue on to Sinai. When Egeria and her fellow pilgrims visited the area around the year 383, the monks read to them passages of scripture concerning the sacred events that had taken place there, and celebrated the liturgy for them. This is an indirect witness to the presence at Sinai of manuscripts of the scriptures and of the services in the 4th century. To these would have been added the sayings of collected wisdom born from experience, the apophthegmata, the sayings of the Desert Fathers. The Monastery of Sinai can trace an uninterrupted history extending back over the course of 1700 years. In all of that time, it has never been destroyed and never been abandoned. The library of over 3,000 manuscripts is famous throughout the world for its antiquity and for the importance of its texts. Is it possible to look at significant examples of these manuscripts and try to gain the larger perspective, asking ourselves, what do these manuscripts tell us about the history of the monastery and about the monks who have lived there and the pilgrims who have come there, both from east and west? We may begin with the Codex Sinaiticus, a manuscript dating the first half of the 4th century, that is, the lifetime of the Emperor Constantine. He put an end to the persecution of the Christians, who were then free to employ professional scribes to create copies of the scriptures using the finest materials. This manuscript contained the whole of the Christian scriptures, from Genesis to the book of Revelation. It also included the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas, all bound into one massive volume. It is very beautiful and impressive manuscript. Of course, scholars esteem it today not for the beauty of its production, but because they feel it preserves an early level of the text. Students of the Greek New Testament and of the Septuagint, the Old Testament translated into Greek, will spend much time studying the text of this manuscript and the Codex Vaticanus, which also dates from the early 4th century. Fenton John Anthony Hort, the great New Testament scholar in the 19th century, has written that if one studies the coincidences of characteristic readings of these two manuscripts, one can recover the common archetype from which both derive, the date of which cannot be later than the early part of the 2nd century and may be yet earlier. Although this manuscript would have reached Sinai at a later time, it is a reminder that in the 4th century, Sinai was an extension of the Holy Land, of the Greek-speaking world. When the Emperor Justinian, in the middle of the 6th century, commanded that a great basilica and high surrounding walls be built at the site of the burning bush, Sinai was yet within the parameter of the Byzantine Empire, or the Roman Empire, as they would still have called it. In the early 7th century, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt came under Arab rule. We know least about the history of Sinai in the centuries immediately following. But there is evidence that pilgrimage to Sinai was not halted by the conquest of the peninsula. And monks continued to come to this remote desert, attracted by its austerity, its biblical associations, and its reputation as an established center of monasticism. In fact, Greek letters flourished in Palestine in the 7th and 8th centuries, with the contributions made by St. John Damascene, Andrew the Jerusalemite, who became Bishop of Crete, Cosmas of Mayuma, Stephen the Savite, George the Sinculus, Michael the Sinculus, and Theodore and Theophanes the Branded. This is reflected in the Sinai Library, which contains numerous Greek manuscripts dating from the 7th to the 10th century. Number 212 is a lectionary from the 7th century. New finds Magicule 5 and 56, dating from the 8th or 9th century, is a tropologion giving hymns and odes for feast days. These are the oldest surviving manuscripts containing the canons composed in iambic verse by St. John of Damascus. New finds 26, dated to the 9th or 10th century, is a school text of the Iliad, giving lines of the poem, alternating with notes on vocabulary and grammar. All of these manuscripts speak of continuity as Sinai after the 7th century, as Greek remained the language of converse, study, and prayer. A few of the Sinai manuscripts are splendid works of art with gilded letters and brilliant illuminations created in Constantinople in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, when the city was at its height as a center of culture and devotion. This is an illumination of Christ from the Codex Theodosianus, a 10th century lectionary created in the Imperial Scriptoria of Constantinople. It has 7 illuminations at the beginning of the manuscript, depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, the 4 evangelists, and Horsius Petrus of Monavata. The manuscript was commissioned out of veneration for this saint. It contains 71 readings of the Gospel for the most important feast days. Every letter on every page was executed in gold leaf. The letters flash and gleam as the pages are turned. But no less significant are the humble manuscripts written at Sinai, often on reused parchment, bound between rough boards, the pages stained from long use, a witness to the deprivations and austerity of Sinai, and to the generations of monks who have maintained the life of devotion and the cycle of daily services at this holy place. This is a manuscript of selected festal homilies written in the 8th or 9th century, very likely at Sinai itself. If Greek is a center for any consideration of the Sinai manuscripts, what do we find when we look east? Sinai has a number of manuscripts written in Christian Palestinian Aramaic. This is a type of Western Aramaic and thus is close to the dialect that would have been spoken by Jesus and his disciples and the first Aramaic-speaking Christians. There are a number of Aramaic words and phrases preserved as such in the Greek New Testament. And he took the damsel by the hand and said unto her, Talitha cumi, which is being interpreted, Damsel, I say unto thee, arise. In St. Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians, he quotes the Aramaic word Maranatha, which means, come, O Lord, or our Lord is come. A prayer that must have been familiar to them and which goes back to the first Aramaic-speaking Christians. A Sinai manuscript written in Christian Palestinian Aramaic that dates from the 7th or 8th century contains the sayings of the Desert Fathers, number 59 in the collection. One of the most beautiful is a lectionary dating from the 13th century, manuscript number 41. Classical Syriac was a language spoken in Upper Mesopotamia. In the late antique world, Syriac-speaking villages stretched from the Mediterranean to the foothills of the Zagoras, and from Antioch to Ctesiphon, the Persian capital. Many important works of Greek philosophy, literature, and medicine were translated into Syriac. In addition, many works of Christian poetry and exegesis were composed in Syriac. The Sinai Library has over 250 manuscripts in Syriac. They are an invaluable resource for the study of the scriptures, the services, and patristic texts. The writings of Dionysius the Areopagite consist of 4 treatises and 10 letters. The 4 treatises are the divine names, the mystical theology, the celestial hierarchy, and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Although these works pass under the name of the Athenian, who was converted by the Apostle Paul, as mentioned in Acts 17:34, the works were not referred to before the close of the 5th century. Earlier controversies over the reliability of these writings were set aside when they were confirmed by Maximus the Confessor and quoted by the Lateral Council held in 649. They were translated into Syriac by Sergius of Ravenna, who died in 536. The oldest surviving manuscript of the works of Dionysius the Areopagite is Sinai Syriac 52, a manuscript of the 6th century, that is, the very century in which these works were first translated into Syriac. Sinai, Palestine, and Egypt came under Arab rule in the 7th century. By the 8th century, Christians were expressing themselves in Arabic and finding their place in Arabic culture. It was then that many works were translated from Syriac into Arabic, or more rarely directly from the Greek. In this way, the torch of learning was passed from the world of classical antiquity to the emerging Arabic-speaking world. The oldest scribal signature in the Sinai Library is found in Greek 32, an 8th century manuscript of the Psalms and Odes, concluding with the Beatitudes. Having written the entire manuscript in a heavy majuscule Greek, the scribe added his own name in Arabic. He wrote, "May God help you, my brother, and give you understanding. Remember me, my brother, for the sake of God." And below, the Psalter has been written in the place of God, Mount Sinai, by the sinner Michael, the disciple of Abba Philotheos. The oldest Arabic manuscripts of Sinai are dated to the last half of the 8th century or the beginning of the 9th, based on their orthography. By the middle of the 9th century, we have dated manuscripts. New Finds 14 and 16, a manuscript of the Gospels, bears a date 859. Arabic 151 is a manuscript of the Epistles of St. Paul and the Acts of the Apostles. The Colophon states that it was translated in Damascus and written in the year 867. While the Greek manuscripts speak of continuity, these speak of change, as Christians adopted Arabic as their native language and found their place within the world of Islam. The same time witnessed the translation of the scriptures and other important texts into Arabic, and the beginning of Arabic as an instinctive language for Christian expression and discourse. There is evidence for Georgian monks at Sinai as early as the 6th century, but this reached a zenith in the 9th and 10th centuries. Georgian scribes copied out manuscripts of the scriptures, lectionaries, and other liturgical books, as well as lives of the saints, homilies, and ascetical writings. Some of these were important translations made at Sinai. There are 86 Georgian manuscripts in the Old Collection. It is an important witness to monks from Georgia living at Sinai, translating text and creating manuscript copies. Sinai Georgian New Finds 13 is a manuscript with various ascetical and hagiographical texts written by a scribe named Michael in the 10th or 11th century. The manuscript is a palimpsest, where the original writing was erased and the valuable parchment used a second time. In 1996, Zaza Alexidze, director of the Center of Manuscripts in Tbilisi, Georgia, began the study of 2 Georgian palimpsests at Sinai. In 2001, he identified the underlying text as Caucasian Albanian, an ancient language once spoken in the Caucasus to the east of Georgia. This language had only survived in a few inscriptions carved on stone, and in one Armenian manuscript that listed the letters of the alphabet. But many of the letters of the Sinai manuscripts were not included in this alphabet. How do you read a text when so many of the letters are unknown? The task was made easier when it became clear that these were texts of passages of the scriptures. The initial study of this text led to an international collaboration with Jost Gebert, Wolfgang Schulz, and Jean-Pierre Maillet. Their studies were published in 2 folio volumes by Bruppels in 2008. Sinai has a collection of 42 Slavic manuscripts. The oldest are written in Glycolytic, the script developed by Saints Cyril and Methodius in the 9th century to facilitate the introduction of Christianity to the Slavic-speaking world. Sinai Slavic New Finds 1 is an Epchologion written in the 11th century. The writing is skillfully executed with colors added in red, green, yellow, azure, and black. The Glycolytic manuscripts at Sinai are evidence that pilgrims came from the Slavic lands soon after their conversion. They are essential for a reconstruction of the earliest Slavic liturgical texts. These are the manuscripts of the Sinai Library if we look east. What do we find if we look west? In the 4th century, the Roman Empire stretched from Hadrian's Wall on the border with Scotland to the first cataract of the Nile in Upper Egypt. It was possible to travel widely within this unified empire. The first desert fathers included those who had left Rome for the deserts of Egypt, of whom St. Arsenius the Great was the most renowned. Sinai also had a monk who had come from Rome, as we learn from Ammonius' account of the 40 martyrs of Sinai and Rhythaw. Around the year 373, a band of Blemis attacked the monks who were living at Rhythaw on the coast of the Red Sea. They killed 39 of the monks. We read, "There were 39 in number, since Domnus, who was born a Roman, was still alive. Then all those who were there took palm branches and went to meet the holy ones in a procession. With great joy and psalms singing, we carried the remains of the holy ones and laid them down across from the fort, all except for Domnus. But when evening came, he also gave up his spirit to Christ. We carried and buried him, not with the holy men, but separately in a place close by them, so that we would not disturb the holy martyrs of Christ by opening the tomb again." Egeria visited Sinai around the year 383. She was from Spain and wrote her account in Latin. She describes a flourishing monastic center at Sinai and was herself even then following an established pilgrim route. She writes, "We had to come out at the head of the valley for this reason as well, because there are many cells of holy men and a church on the spot where the bush stands, and this bush is still alive today and gives forth shoots." For Pope Gregory the Great, Sinai remained the emblem of spiritual quiet, far from the heavy demands of being the Pope of Rome. In August of 594, he wrote a letter to Rusticiana, a patrician whom Mehemet had Constantinople while serving there as a papal representative, in which he said, "Upon receiving what your Excellency wrote, I learned with joy that you had reached Mount Sinai. Believe me, I would have liked to have gone with you, but certainly not to have returned with you." Learning about the infirmary at Sinai and that it lacked beds and bedding, he wrote a letter to the Abbot John on September the 1st, 600, sending him 15 sheets, 30 blankets, 15 beds, with enough funds to purchase mattresses and have them transported to the monastery. Pilgrims from the Latin-speaking West continued to travel to the Holy Land after the era came under Arab rule. Arculf, a Frankish bishop, visited the Holy Land around the year 680. His account of the Holy Land was written down at Iona, the monastery on the western coast of Scotland. In 724, Willibald led a party of Saxons from Britain to Jerusalem. He eventually became an abbot in southern Germany. A Sinai icon points to continuing contact between the Holy Land and Rome. In this icon, Christ is depicted affixed to the cross, wearing a red-brown collobium. Streams of blood and water issue from his side. To his right stands the Virgin Mary. She points to Christ with her right hand, and with her left holds the handkerchief to her cheek. Above are the monograms for Agia Maria, the Holy Mary. To Christ's left is a youthful John the theologian. His depiction is described simply Ioannis, John. Above, angels look on in wonder, while the sun and the moon are darkened. Below, 3 soldiers divide Christ's garments. This is the earliest icon giving the names of the 2 thieves, Gestas to Christ's right and Demas to his left. Earlier icons invariably portray Christ with his eyes opened before his death. The Sinai icon is the first to depict him with his eyes closed and bearing the crown of thorns. This was done to emphasize his human nature. Anastasius of Sinai in the Oligos, the guidebook written in the 680s, notes the importance of depicting the reality of Christ's death. This and several stylistic details make it possible that the icon was painted at Sinai. Parallels can be seen between the Sinai icon and the fresco of the crucifixion in the chapel of Theodotus at the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua in Rome. Kurt Weitzman writes, "The treatment of the collobium, with its long parallel folds receding over the right thigh, is similar to the collobium of Christ in Santa Maria Antiqua in Rome, which can be dated to the period of Pope Zacharias I, 741 to 752. The fleshy faces of the Virgin and John may also be compared. Whether the Roman fresco painter was a Greek, in which case we would assume that he came from Palestine, or a Roman under Palestinian influence, is difficult to decide. But the similarities between the 2 monuments sufficiently justify, in our opinion, a date for the icon not far removed from that of the Roman fresco, that is, in the 8th century. Given this evidence of communication between Sinai and the Latin West, both before and after the coming of Arab rule, it is surprising that the old collection has only 1 Latin manuscript. It contains the Psalms, missing several choirs, a calendar of selected saints, a list of the apostles and the places where they preached, a list of the liberal arts, and the Passion of Saints Peter and Paul. A number of aspects of the orthography, punctuation, and contractions are otherwise unknown in Latin manuscripts, but they would be natural to one versed in Greek and Syriac scribal practices. The history and provenance of such a manuscript becomes more clear if we compare it to 2 other Sinai manuscripts that have Latin folia used as end leaves. Sinai Greek 567 is a Menean for the month of November. There are 6 paper fly leaves in Latin at the beginning of the manuscript and 6 at the end. These contain parts of a Latin antiphonary with portions of the Christian service and the feasts of St. Stephen, St. James and John, and the Holy Innocents. Sinai Arabic 455 contains homilies, lives of the saints, and parts of the Old Testament. 2 parchment leaves with Latin script now serve as fly leaves at the beginning of the manuscript. These contain texts from an epistolary. If we compare the 3 texts, we see that they are the products of the same scriptorium, though produced at different times. Features otherwise unknown in Latin manuscripts may be seen in all 3. The epistolary seems to date from the 9th century, with the Psalter and the antiphonary dating to the 10th century. The evidence points to a scriptorium where Latin was still alive, though at some remove from the Latin-speaking West, and in an area where the scribes were bilingual or even trilingual, accustomed to writing in Greek and Syriac or Arabic. It is likely that the manuscript was written at Jerusalem or one of the areas of the Holy Land. We should not rule out the possibility that they were written at Sinai. These manuscripts become an important witness to a Latin presence in the Holy Land before the First Crusade. The Sinai archives contain a parchment manuscript with parts of the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom transliterated from Greek into Latin characters. On the left we read, Doxa Patri ke io ke agio pneumati, ke nin ke ai ke istus eonas ton eonon. Amen. This document is dated to the 12th century. 2 leaves attached to Sinai Greek 1586, a 14th century Sticherarion, contain parts of the hymn Stabat Mater, written in Latin, transliterated into Greek characters, and translated into Greek. The Greek translation reads, Stachimana ponemeni iston stavron apolipismeni eki opu ekremesen oios. Sinai Greek 1208 is a collection of patristic texts dating to the 15th century. A scribe used one of the final leaves to write out the Sator square, the well-known Latin palindrome, using Greek letters complete with accents and breathing marks. In the year 1026, a Sinai monk named Simeon took relics of St. Catherine to the Duke of Normandy, a benefactor of St. Catherine's Monastery. These were placed in the newly founded abbey at Rouen, from where the veneration of St. Catherine spread through the Latin-speaking West. Latin pilgrims came to Sinai throughout the period of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem and continued to do so in the centuries following. An icon of St. Catherine painted in the Gothic style is an important witness to this. In 1387, the Catalan ambassador to Damascus commissioned an icon of St. Catherine to be painted in Barcelona as a gift to the monastery. A Latin inscription at the base of the icon records the donation and the year. At the top left of the icon, one can see the coat of arms of the King of Catalan. 2 recent developments promise to increase the manuscript evidence for connections between Sinai and the Latin West. In 1975, repairs were being carried out in the Tower of St. George, which projects from the north wall of the monastery. A deposit of manuscript leaves and fragments came to light. We know now that this is where the oldest manuscripts were kept centuries ago, since it is one of the most secure rooms in the monastery. In 1734, Archbishop Nikiforos Marthalis created new quarters for the monastery library and asked that the manuscripts be gathered there from the numerous places where they had been stored before. Manuscripts that were already in a ruinous state were left behind in the tower room. These manuscripts are known collectively as the new finds. Among them were missing quires from the Sinai Latin Psalter. It is now almost complete. There was also a Latin liturgical manuscript with over 40 individual leaves and fragments with Latin text. The scholar responsible for publishing the catalogue of the new finds did not think that the Latin manuscripts and fragments were numerous enough to merit a catalogue of their own. But even a single leaf will allow us to read and identify the text, to determine the style of the script, and to assign a probable date for the script, and to consider the way in which it might have reached Sinai. Each leaf and fragment is important in piecing together the connections between Sinai and the West. These leaves are even now being studied by Michelle Brown, a recognized authority on the Lensfarne Gospels, and in time a catalogue of the Sinai Latin new finds will be published. They are written in a variety of scripts and cover a considerable span of time. Among them are music manuscripts with notations in Gregorian chant. The second development is the recovery of the Sinai palimpsest through multispectral imaging. A palimpsest is a manuscript where the original text was erased and the valuable parchment used a second time. The underlying text most often survives as a faint image, but until now, these have eluded attempts to read them. But by photographing these manuscripts with a range of narrow bandwidths of light, ranging from ultraviolet through the visible spectrum to infrared, and then manipulating the color channels and enhancing the image, the faint underlying text very often becomes clear and legible. Sinai Arabic New Finds 8 and 28 are a manuscript of the Gospels in Arabic, dated to the second half of the 8th century or the beginning of the 9th. Parchment must have been very difficult to obtain at that time. The leaves of this manuscript are very often sewn together from 2, 3, or 4 smaller patches, and most of these leaves are where the original text was erased. A decorative initial is faintly visible on one leaf, and Latin is visible in the margin below. Multispectral imaging allows us to see the text more clearly. It is written in an insular script, a style of writing developed in Ireland that spread to England, where it flourished between AD 600 and 850. This was the age of Aidan and Cuthbert and Bede, the time of an unusual flowering of monasticism in England. Scholars have long noted parallels between earliest monasticism in the British Isles and earliest monasticism in Egypt, in its organization, its architecture, and its spiritual ethos. Now, for the first time, we have manuscript evidence for a link between that world and Sinai. We have only now completed the photography of this manuscript with multispectral imaging as it is studied and analyzed, not only for the text that it contains, but for the archaeological levels, as it were, of the underlying and superimposed text. Its history will become more clear, but already it points to interconnections that have been little appreciated in histories of that time and in our own time. Pope John Paul II, canonized as a saint earlier this year, visited Sinai as a pilgrim on February the 26th in the year 2000 as a part of his visits to the holy places that he made to mark the new millennium. Although this was the first time a pope has visited Sinai, yet he was the latest in a long line of pilgrims to Sinai from the Latin West, extending back to the 4th century. In concluding the address he made at that time, he said, "May the Monastery of St. Catherine be a spiritual oasis for members of all the churches in search of the glory of the Lord, which abode upon Mount Sinai." Thank you. If anyone has questions or would like clarifications, I would be happy to answer the questions.
Father, I was curious, why would flyleaves in Latin be attached to texts in another language? What would be the reason?
The flyleaf is a part of the binding, and they would use manuscripts that were already falling apart. Often the binding would break down, parts of it would be lost, it would be considered expendable for other uses. So it was a way of recycling earlier manuscripts. But many times the leaves that survive in the bindings become very, very important. Perhaps the rest of the manuscript did not survive, and so it becomes a witness to earlier texts that may not be extant elsewhere. Kurt Weissman spoke at St. John's Abbey in Minnesota in the 1970s, and when I visited there in 1997, I was given a copy of his lecture. He felt that the presence of Latin in leaves and the absence of complete Latin manuscripts of Sinai could be attributed to the monks intentionally destroying Latin manuscripts. But we know more about the bindings and the manuscripts now than they did in 1970. People have taken doctorates on the tooling of the manuscripts, and this has allowed us to put together the manuscripts that were made at the same workshop and to identify whether these were made at Sinai or brought from elsewhere. And many of the manuscripts that have Latin inleaves were brought from elsewhere, from Italy, from Crete, where Latin manuscripts would have been extant. I don't think you can make a case that Latin manuscripts were intentionally destroyed.
If you travel to see other early manuscripts in other libraries, have you seen Tom Field's Psalm book that he copied early?
I have had few opportunities to travel, and it is my responsibility to photograph the manuscripts that are at Sinai, and then I make them available to scholars. So a lot that I know about the manuscripts has been from the scholars who point out the significance and the importance of the manuscripts. So I have facilitated more the study of the Sinai manuscripts more than I have made a study of them on my own.
Thank you for coming. And will this be made available to the public?
Yes, it is being filmed, and there are plans to make it available.
In your opinion, the majority of the manuscripts there at Mount Sinai, were they written at Mount Sinai, or is this a repository of manuscripts that maybe can be preserved, that were written and used in other places, and then brought to Mount Sinai for being preserved from destruction?
If there's a colophon, then it becomes invaluable in knowing who wrote it, when it was written. Even if they don't give the year, they will give the name many times as a way of a prayer. Pray for me, remember me, and then we can detect who was the scribe, and if no date is given from the orthography, we can very often assign a date. And that has allowed us to know with a fair degree of certainty which manuscripts were written at Sinai. And they were written at Sinai in a number of languages from the people from various countries, from the whole of Christendom, who came to Sinai and wrote there. But many times it is frustrating because there is no indication as to whether the manuscript was written there or brought there, and then it becomes an educated guess as to whether the one was true or the other.
And a follow-up question. St. Catherine's being the longest functioning monastery, Orthodox monastery in the world, is there any kind of way to track the history of, for example, liturgical manuscripts that were actually used at St. Catherine's, so that scholars could possibly see the development of the liturgical rites as preserved?
I think it is exceptional for liturgical manuscripts. Studies have been made of the Liturgy of St. James. We have many manuscripts of that liturgy, and the case has been made that the Liturgy of St. James remained the standard liturgy at Sinai longer than elsewhere. We know that as a rule, remote areas are the more conservative, and traditions in remote areas tend to be kept, or they have changed in other areas. Also, the monastery has an invaluable collection of Syriac and Georgian manuscripts, and scholars have pointed out that many times Greek liturgical texts were translated into Syriac and Georgian, and then the Greek changed. So the earlier Greek survives in the Georgian and Syriac witnesses, and scholars have come to Sinai trying to reconstruct the Typicon of Jerusalem before the 10th century, and looking specifically at the Syriac and Georgian manuscripts. So it is an invaluable resource for the study of the development of liturgical texts. Something that I didn't include in the presentation was another Epiphytic manuscript that was recovered with the new finds, and unfortunately it has suffered from water damage, and only parts of the page can be read. But we were very happy to see that if this is photographed with multispectral imaging, even though it's not strictly speaking a palimpsest and that it does not have a text superimposed, the text in these faded areas that cannot be read with visible light become clear. And this is being studied by a scholar in Vienna who's focusing on the earliest liturgical texts in the Slavic languages, and he is very, very happy that we have been able to, that we have the prospect of recovering more of the text of this particular manuscript, because he feels it is one of the most significant in recovering the early Slavic liturgical practices.
Were there trends in content as well as languages over the ages? So, for example, just making this up, that maybe in 1 century people were copying more liturgical material, another maybe they were copying more Old Testament material, or are there all sorts of content at all times?
That's one of the most interesting aspects of the library. It's not just a collection of texts, but because the manuscripts exist in the original context of the monastery where they were created and where they were used, we can try to reconstruct such questions as did certain texts predominate at certain times. So we can reconstruct the history of the monastery in ways where other evidence does not survive. One person has said we have over 50 manuscripts of the Psalter written in magical Greek. This does not tell us something about the text of the Psalms, but it tells us a tremendous amount about the use of the Psalter. And so it's very important and very interesting to try to reconstruct the history of the monastery, especially from the 7th to the 10th century, when other sources are not extant.
Could you use a mic, please? Just make everybody hear your question. There's one on that side. Thank you.
Father, first I want to thank you for coming out to Villanova on a cold evening. I'm sure it's much warmer back at St. Catherine's. But I want to thank you for doing what you have done over your many years at Mount Sinai, making the sacred manuscripts available to the world. And for those of us who are Orthodox, we thank you. But I also wanted to ask you, what is the state of your project right now? Have all the manuscripts been cataloged and preserved and digitized, or is there still more to come?
Sinai and Jerusalem were both quite remote, and the manuscripts had not been accessible to scholars except those who were able to travel with great difficulty. In 1950, the Library of Congress came to Sinai, and they photographed about half of the manuscripts for microfilm. But I've seen some of these microfilms, and many of them were out of focus. Sometimes they would miss a page. Sometimes the notations are too small to be read. And since microfilms are black and white, you miss the alternation of black and red ink that is so important in liturgical manuscripts. So even though these were photographed before for microfilm, there is every justification for photographing them anew with high-resolution digital cameras. We are in the midst of the renovation of the building at the monastery to provide better housing and storage conditions for the manuscripts, and to provide better facilities for the scholars who come and want to study them and read the manuscripts there. It was always envisioned that this will include conservation workshops and will include special rooms dedicated to the digital photography of the manuscripts. I have been doing what I can, but the hours in which I'm free to photograph the manuscripts are limited because of the cycle of service that we have and the other responsibilities of the monastery. But when we have the new facilities, our goal is to have additional equipment and to bring in a staff to photograph them in a more robust program. And that is what we need in order to try to enhance the collection of digital manuscripts that we already have. So in a way, we have laid good foundations, but we have only begun with the digital photography of the manuscripts. We want to focus especially on the Arabic and Syriac manuscripts, and this would be important in reminding the world of the Christian Arabic presence in the Middle East, and it would encourage Christian Arabs in the Middle East to remember their heritage and to understand it in greater detail. The week after I get back, scholars from Georgia will be coming to study the Georgian manuscripts with the goal of creating a complete catalog of the Georgian manuscripts. And the palimpsest project that we have is a 5-year project. We are about halfway through at this point. So there are many ongoing projects and prospective projects.
Father, if I may turn us aside for a moment from the world of manuscripts. Those of us who hold the monastery in our hearts and our prayers have been very concerned with conflicting reports that have come to us in the West about the security situation. And I was wondering if you might comment on the current status of the monastery and how things stand in the current situation in the Sinai.
One scholar wrote an essay recently and pointed out that Sinai has always been a place of danger. In the 4th century, monks were killed, so there was a heroism in going to Sinai in the first place. The isolation of the monastery protected it. When the Persians sacked Jerusalem in 614, it wasn't worth their while to go through the desert and come to the monastery. But the isolation of the monastery came to an end in the 1970s with the construction of the present roads, so we cannot count anymore on the isolation to protect the monastery. And we must think very carefully about preserving the treasures that we have, because there have been times when libraries have been destroyed even by careless fires, and we constantly read about these and think of what a loss it would be if we lost the Library of Sinai. So we have to be very serious about our responsibility for these texts. Some of the alarming headlines that we read are because of conflicts that are taking place in the north, where the Sinai borders with Gaza. There are tunnels where things were smuggled into Gaza. The government is trying to close these so that communication with Gaza is made formally with government control. The Bedouin who have profited from the smuggling are unhappy with this development, and there's a war now between the government and the Bedouin who live on the border with Gaza. But on the headlines it will say, policemen killed in Sinai, and you think of Sinai as a whole. You don't think of just the border with Gaza, which is actually 500 kilometers away from Sinai. In reality, Sinai has remained a place of security and peace throughout these conflicts. The government knows that many people come to Egypt specifically to visit the monastery, and so there are many checkpoints to control access to the monastery and to ensure that nothing happens to the visitors who come to the area. So the many safeguards are in place, and I can say that with the present government in Egypt, things are becoming more stable, and so we have every reason to hope for greater security, and visitors are coming now in greater numbers than was the case a few years ago.
Father, thank you for coming. I'm curious about the logistics. You mentioned 500 kilometers. How many hours is that? Like, if you were to, do you take a plane? Is there a helicopter that shows up? Like how many people live there? I mean, I'm trying to imagine the logistics of bringing food. Is there a spring? Is there water? I mean, how did, that's nothing to do with manuscripts, I guess, but how do you manage that?
Two books have recently been written about remarkable twin sisters who came to Sinai in the 1890s. And it's a reminder of the difficulty of travel to Sinai until quite recent times. When they came to Sinai, they would need a letter of introduction from the Archbishop, who would always live in Cairo because he needed to be accessible. So they would have to go to Cairo with introductions, gain a letter for admission to the monastery, and then they would travel to Suez. And once they were at Suez, they would have to organize a whole caravan with supplies and food and porters and guides, and then this entire caravan would cross the desert. It took them 8 days to go south along the coast of the Red Sea, and once they reached the level of the monastery, then they would turn inland, and it was another 2-day trek to the monastery. They would stay there for a month at a time. They had to bring food to last them the entire month. And you realize the complications, the difficulty, the expense of going to Sinai, and the heroism of anyone who would go there to live, knowing the lack of support, the austerity that was inherent in going there. But people went there precisely because of the austerity, and in the silence of Sinai, they reached very great spiritual heights. Today, transportation is easy, and we have so many conveniences compared to ancient times, so it is a reminder of the austerity that was there in earlier times, of the spiritual heritage that flourished within that austerity, and of the need for the monastery to maintain that spiritual heritage where the isolation has come to an end and conditions have changed, but the spiritual goals have not changed and need to be maintained. There's an oasis there, so we have spring water. There was a garden where in the past times the monks depended very much on the garden for fruits and produce. Today it's very easy to bring produce, so the garden is kept for fruit trees. We have apples, apricots, grapes, prickly pear, and things like that, and it is a special thing to think that these are products that come from Sinai itself. So much has changed, but the spiritual goals that have been preserved at Sinai need to be maintained in the midst of these changes.
Could you say a few words about the relics and icons that you've chosen to display?
No, I would want Father John. This is his work, so perhaps at the end of this session he could explain the things that are on display here. These are icons and relics that he has brought for this occasion.
Yes, Father Justin, I was wondering how large is the monastic brotherhood, and you are American. How multinational is it?
Sinai has always been predominantly Greek throughout its history, even as people of other countries have visited there as pilgrims, have lived there as monastics, and that has remained the case to the present day. So it's astonishing to think that it was Greek in the 4th century because it was within the orbit of Jerusalem and part of the Greek-speaking world, and that could have changed in the 7th century with the coming of Arab rule, but the Greek heritage that was there in the 4th century has come in even into our own time. We have 10th century lectionaries, and it's exciting to think that we can take a lectionary from the library written in the 10th century. We could use it in our services today because the language and the readings have all remained the same. So there's a special sense of continuity at Sinai. There is a rule that you must be of Greek descent to join the community, but one monk said, we have our rules and we have the exceptions to the rules. So it's by exception to the rule that we have one monk from England and myself from the United States, but all of the other monks of the monastery are of Greek descent. And they're very eager, and I think justifiably so, to preserve the Greek heritage there.
Just a couple of questions about the manuscripts. You mentioned the more complete Latin text having some oddities in the Latin that might be an influence from the Greek and Syriac roots of the people writing it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, and more broadly, I'm curious about the range of physical conditions of the manuscripts or the sort of preservation efforts that might be needed for the manuscripts themselves.
There was a scholar named Lowe who made an exhaustive study of the Latin manuscripts of Sinai, and he lists all of the peculiarities, and it becomes a bit technical, but if you were to look for his essays, then this has all the information. And in 2007, I spoke at Yale University, and the student who had helped Professor Lowe write these essays introduced himself. He's quite elderly now, and I was happy to meet him, and he presented me with copies that were written by his teacher. And Michelle Brown has been asked to make a catalog of the existing Latin manuscripts, and then she will be including information that has not been previously published. When Kurt Weizmann came to Sinai in the late 50s and early 60s, his expeditions were funded by Arthur Houghton, who was responsible for the Rare Books Library at Harvard. He owned Steuben Glass, he was a person of means, and so he personally funded Weizmann's expeditions. And because of that, he came there with his daughter and his secretary once when Weizmann was working there, and Weizmann was able to show him many of the illuminated manuscripts and many of the treasures of the monastery. And he was upset that many of the manuscripts are in a very dilapidated state. And he thought that this was something that he could fix. And so he offered funding for the manuscripts to be rebound. And Weizmann was putting a lot of pressure on Archbishop Porphyrios and the community to accept this generous offer. He said, you won't have this offer again. All the manuscripts can be rebound. But when it was put to the vote of the community, they rejected his offer. They said, we don't want foreigners touching our manuscripts. And today, people have said it may be the preeminent library in the whole world for intact early bindings. And today, there's concern to preserve as much as possible. If something is deteriorating, you check the causes of the deterioration, but you do not rebind things wholesale, as was done so much in the 19th century, even into the 20th century. So we are fortunate that so much of the library is intact. We may have intact bindings from the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries that almost do not exist anywhere else in the world. There are thousands of Byzantine manuscripts at the Vatican, but only 2% are in the original bindings, because it was a style in earlier centuries to rebind manuscripts just to keep them in the current fashion, and things were rebound in a way that would not be done today. So we have to be very, very sensitive and very careful. Now that things can be done so easily at Sinai, this heritage could be wiped out very quickly. So we have to be very cautious. We do not do such work ourselves. We expect conservators with years of practice to come and do the work, but we do have to make the decisions. And many times the best decision is to protect a manuscript as it is, because it's been pointed out that any intervention destroys part of the monastery's history. And even if you do intervene to rebind a manuscript, these days careful records are made and all of the original materials are kept, so that a later scholar knows what has been done and can examine the earlier evidence. So we are fortunate that now, when things are done so much more carefully, when the approach is so much more conservative, only now are the conservation needs of the monastery being addressed.
As you said, Father, there are many treasures, tremendous iconography in St. Catherine's Monastery. Are there any relationships that you've discovered, that have been discovered, between the manuscripts and the icons that are part of the Sinai treasure?
The question is the connections between the manuscripts and the icons. It would be a dream to find that the same artist made illuminations in a manuscript and created icons, because then you could see parallels. Illuminations tend to survive better because most of the time the book is closed, and even fugitive pigments can survive in a manuscript that would not survive in a panel icon. And also panel icons tend to be reverenced. They are exposed to candles, incense. They are exposed to the changes in climate, and many times a person will varnish an icon to try to enhance it, to try to check deterioration. So they change over time, much more so than illuminations. I think it's difficult to say that the same artist would have done both. But there are traces. In both the icons and the manuscripts, many times angels are depicted wearing red shoes that have white polka dots. And this is such a striking feature that I've noticed it both in the icons and the illuminations, and I think that more work needs to be done to try to detect if some of these could have been done by the same artist. But these are very different media, and Sinai was always a place of austerity, and manuscripts with illuminations would have required supplies and skills that I think were not so common at Sinai. So there are a few illuminated manuscripts that we feel might have been done at Sinai, but in general they were made in Constantinople, where they had the imperial scriptoria and then brought to Sinai. So it is something that deserves investigation, but not much has been done in that field.
Father, I'm in the history program here, and lately they're making us all learn how to use computers to be better historians. So I was curious, out at your monastery, what work's being done to increase internet capability, to retrofit the old buildings to have modern computer technology?
When I first went to the monastery, there was no computer access. And I remember my parents were eager for me to take a typewriter because they were horrified at the thought that I would be writing them letters and then they would have to read my handwriting. And it was an American who worked at Sinai who took a liking to the monastery and said, you people need internet connections because you need to keep in touch with scholars around the world. So he gave us the first computer that had a modem. He set up an account for us. At the time, the telephone communications were terrible, and you could stay online for a few minutes and then the connection would break. But Egypt was trying to develop the hotels on the coast as a major tourist attraction, and they said, how can we do that when we don't have decent telephone communications? So they put in fiber optics for the principal lines through the peninsula, and then suddenly the communication became very stable. So even though we have slow speeds compared to the rest of the world, it is steady, and it allows us to be in email contact with scholars around the world. The national libraries feel an obligation to the general public, and the British Library has photographed illuminated manuscripts and then made them freely available online. They feel that if a high school student can use these in an essay he is writing, it far outweighs the chance that someone is going to take the illuminations and then use them in a way for his own profit. The monks of Sinai tend not to trust the internet. They feel that if anything is on the internet, it becomes freely available, even if you try to make watermarks and post it in such a way to inhibit downloading. Eventually someone will find a way around this, and so they become skeptical about the internet, and they want safeguards in place to ensure responsible use. So part of our task is to find ways in which we can ensure responsible use and at the same time post things online. The Palimpsest project has as one of its conditions that all of the materials will be placed online at a dedicated site that's being put together even now by computer programmers, and I feel that this will be an important precedent for other manuscripts being made available. So we don't have any internet presence now. In reality, people write me and say, have you photographed this manuscript? And if I have, I send them the copies, and if I haven't, then I photograph it for them. And sometimes I can send them these texts over the internet, but it's not an internet site yet. So that remains to be done. Sinai has an amazing library for manuscripts and quite a pitiful library for research. But we find that increasingly you don't have to have everything at one site if you are in contact with scholars who do have access to research libraries, and then articles can be scanned and online access can be forwarded, so things become possible at Sinai for research there that was not possible before. So we see in our own experience the need for internet access, both to make the Sinai manuscripts accessible and to make the resources of research libraries accessible to scholars and the monks there at Sinai.
Father, on behalf of St. Herman's and of course Father Rich, we'd like again to thank you for coming this evening and also for your talk yesterday at Eastern University. Tomorrow we'll leave for the monastery. Father is anxious to go to St. Tikhon's. He's never been to St. Tikhon's Monastery, which is the oldest monastery in the United States, and he's anxious to go there. He'll be there for Thursday and Friday and will present a lecture on Friday night in the Repository Museum of the Orthodox Church in America, and it'll be entitled The Tabernacle in the Wilderness, Mount Sinai, Past and Future Hope, if I'm not mistaken. Concerning the relics that you see in the front there, it is the reliquary of St. Catherine of Alexandria. Inside you'll see there's her relics, and next to that is the reliquary of the actual leaves from the burning bush that Father graciously brought us 2 years ago, and we have them enshrined in St. Herman's, and you can see actually 3 of the leaves of this burning bush. The icon next to it is an antique icon. It is the icon of the burning bush, and if I'm not mistaken, last night you said, Father, that the original name of the monastery was the Mother of God. And as you can see, it was the Monastery of the Mother of God, and this is why it's always connected with this icon of the Mother of God, of the burning bush. In Russian or in Slavonic, it's a very famous icon. It's interesting to note historically in the Russian church that this icon was always kept in very unusual places, basically to protect the house, but more so the barns, because this icon was sort of a fire prevention icon for the Russian people. So it's maybe that's what has protected the monastery all these years from any kind of damage or fires. And so this is an explanation of the icons that you see there. Again, Father, thank you very much for your talk this evening, but most of all for your graciousness to share your stories. I think that one last one maybe would be, how did you become a monk at Mount Sinai?
I think for my own story, I would say that I became fascinated with history, and a study of medieval history led me to Byzantine history. And I had read many texts in Byzantine history before I began to concentrate on the early church. And only then did I begin to attend Orthodox services. I remember how bewildering they were at the beginning because I didn't have any sense of the order of the service, but I was determined to connect what I was seeing with what I had already read. And then it was as if I found a great treasure. So I became Orthodox in university. And people have said that the interest in history that first attracted me to the Orthodox Church and the sense of continuity is the daily experience there at Sinai. We have daily worship in a service that was built at the command of the Emperor Justinian in the year 550. I've mentioned the continuity of the manuscripts and how they could be used in the services even today. And when the Archbishop celebrates the Divine Liturgy, at the great entrance he holds the chalice and commemorates all of the departed. And he begins by saying, "Remember, O Lord, the founders of the sacred monastery, the sovereigns Justinian and Theodora." And one person commented at Sinai, it's as if the 6th century never really ended. So that continuity that first attracted me to the Orthodox Church is our daily experience at Sinai.